Winemaking in the United States and California. Written by my coworker Ralph Patrick Chaston and friend. Let's go. Grapes have been on Earth for at least 60 million years, as fossil records indicate. Wine is a semi-natural product. When yeast is added to sugar, alcohol is one of the effects. There is natural yeast in the air and on fruit skins, causing the fruit to ferment on their own, if put into a container. The first time hunter-gatherers stored fruit for too long, wine was made and must have been drunk. Supposedly, 10% of our liver has evolved to metabolize alcohol. The earliest recorded form of a fermented drink was made from rice, honey, and fruit and was found in the jars of China that were dated to be around 9,000 years old. The earliest known wines made from grapes were around 8,000 years old. Archaeologists found traces of it in the ceramic jars from that time period in Sholaveri, a region in the southwest part of the country of Georgia. The oldest winery that has been discovered is 6,100 years old, located in mountains of Armenia. The site contained a wine press, fermentation vats, jars, and cups. The Phoenicians and Greeks had the first impact on winemaking in Europe and spread winemaking throughout the Mediterranean, but it was the Romans that had the biggest impact. Many of today's great wine regions started out as large Roman plantations, and many of today's grapes can be traced back to the vines that they cultivated. They also refined winemaking techniques that we still use today. Wine was very important to the Romans, and everyone drank it, including slaves, peasants, women, and of course the aristocrats. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD had a large impact on the Roman wine industry. Pompeii was home to vast vineyards and was a principal source of wine for the city of Rome. It served as an important trading city with many of the Roman provinces throughout the empire, as it was one of the great port cities in Italy. The volcano destroyed the town itself, including the storage warehouses and the surrounding vineyards. After the fall of Roman Empire, the church took over most of the vineyards along with the winemaking practices and established laws on drinking. They declared that being intoxicated was a sin, but condoned the act of drinking wine anyway. The early wines until medieval times were made with natural yeast and could only produce a wine with a minimum of 10% alcohol. Although wines could be made from all fruits, grapes turn out to be the best fruit for winemaking. Most other fruit does not have either the high sugar content to ferment, too low of acidity, or not the natural yeast the grapes have. Wines and ales were the preferred drink during the Middle Ages, but water was still consumed, especially in the country. It just wasn't written about much. Vineyards were planted just about everywhere there was a church. The highest quality wines were produced by the monks for the church leaders, and the low quality was for the sacramental wine. If you grew your own grapes, you could make your own wine for personal use, but the large vineyards were controlled by the church. Harvesting was a family affair, but the handling of the picked grapes and fermentation was mostly done by the males. Pubs and taverns were a place to get wine and ales, and they were taxed, which gave the city good revenue. At that time, grape varietals were already known and coveted. An essay on agriculture in 1305 listed 13 white grape varietals and 8 black grape varietals. Wood casks were invented by the Celts or the Gauls before the Romans invaded, but were used for their ales. The Romans had used clay pots for wine storage and transportation and found the wood containers beneficial. Glass bottles were not used until the 1600s when coal-burning furnaces were invented. Glass was invented around 3000 BC in Syria, and the Romans developed the technique of glass blowing bottles, but they tended to break easy or even explode. Glass needed the high heat of coal to make them stronger. Corks have been used as a stopper since 3000 BC. Wine cellars, especially by the rich, were becoming sophisticated and large. Some were so big that their walls were the foundation of homes. The Black Death/plague and the many wars that broke out during this time created havoc with the wine trade. Not only did vineyards change hands, some were destroyed in the process. The 100 Years' War, from 1337 to 1453, between France and England, was one of the worst for the wine trade. Both France and England suffered because of it. France had a large wine trade business with England before then and lost many acres of vineyards during the attacks from England. England had to go to out of country for wine, which led to the ports from Portugal. The first European grapevines in the New World arrived with Columbus' second voyage of 1494. Ferdinand, the King of Spain, banned the planting of vines in the New World in 1503, and it was honored until after his death in 1516. After a successful planting of vines in Mexico City in 1524, Cortés promoted the establishment of vines and made it a requirement for the Spanish settlers that wanted to acquire land in the New World to plant vineyards. The grapes they brought with them were called mission grapes and did well in the warm climate. Vineyards sprung all over Central America and were producing drinkable wine. In 1602, in Asuncion, the capital city of Paraguay, there was 187 vineyards totaling 1,007,668,000 individual plants or more. Some of the wines coming from Spain were spoiling because of lousy storage capabilities, but Spain wanted their wines to be sold in the New World, and in 1595 the Spanish crown banned vineyards again. They also banned the export of Peruvian wine to Panama in 1614 and in Guatemala in 1615. This time the ban was almost completely ignored. The first wine made in the US was somewhere around 1562 to 1564 by French Huguenots in Florida. They probably used Scuppernong grapes that grew in the southeast. It is the state fruit of North Carolina. There is a grapevine in Roanoke Island that claims to be the oldest cultivated grapevine in the world at over 400 years old. The Guinness World Book of Records say the oldest grapevine in the world is also over 400 years old in Slovenia. In 1619, the Jamestown settlers signed into a law a requirement that each male had to plant 10 grapevines each. The hope was that the colony would become a major source of wine for the British Empire, but it failed miserably. The vines that were brought from Europe were met with terrible growing conditions. The cold winters followed by hot, humid summers were only part of the problem. The worst problem was unknown. It was the disease phylloxera, an aphid-like insect that feeds on the roots and leaves on grapevines. This is the same exact insect that 250 years later would travel to Europe and destroy most of the grape crops there. In 1683, William Penn planted the vineyard of a hybrid grape. It was a European red grape that can trace its lineage to the grapes found in those ceramic jars of Georgia and a native grape, possibly the Concord grape found throughout the eastern United States. They called it Alexander. It is still produced today in that part of the U.S. One of the first commercial wineries in the United States were found in Pennsylvania in 1787. Another winery in Indiana, established in 1806, claims to be the first commercial winery in America. The first grapes planted in California were planted in LA, Los Angeles, in 1779. At each of the Spanish mission, a vineyard was planted. These were mission grapes, and for the most part, they didn't do too well in the moist coastal climate. In 1773, an Italian viticulturist named Philip Mazzei from Tuscany set off from Italy to Virginia with some European vines at the request of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. He was asked to come with the promise of land from Virginia legislature. His first stop was Monticello, where Jefferson convinced him to become his neighbor and gave him 193 acres south of the property. The next year, he added 281 acres and then started the Virginia Wine Company. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson was just a couple of the 38 shareholders in the company. Although many of the vines died soon after planting, Mazzei said that he found Virginia soil and climate superior to that of Italy. Mazzei was also famous for being the originator of the line in the Declaration of Independence, "All men are created equal," and was sent to Italy to borrow money for the Revolutionary War. The discovery of a native grape from the East Coast, the Catawba, and its transplant into the Ohio River Valley in 1842 led to the country's first sparkling wine. The wine was so good that a newspaper in London described Catawba as finer wine of the Hock species and flavor that any Hock that comes from the Rhine. End quotes. And wrote that, quote, that sparkling Cadaba transcends the champagne of France, end quotes. A Hock is the British term for a German white wine. Unfortunately, the grapes eventually died off when a fungus disease destroyed the vineyards. Some of the vineyard owners moved to New York and started the Finger Lakes region, where the fungus wasn't as bad. Buena Vista Winery in Sonoma was started in 1857, and soon American wines started winning awards in Europe's wine tasting events and world's fairs. California was leading the way, but other regions were winning awards too. 1860 was a bad year for wine. Europe was starting to face its worst agricultural nightmare. The phylloxera insect arrived. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, grapevines were sent to Europe for study. The botanists that wanted them didn't realize the American plants carried with them a deadly pest. These plants traveled in sailing ships. The first steam ship was built in 1818, but the first steam ship built to cross the Atlantic wasn't until 1838. The Mayflower took 65 days to cross and still took several weeks during the Revolutionary War. The SS Britain in 1845, a modern steamship, took only 14 days. The theory is that phylloxera did not survive the longer trips before steamships, and that in 1850s, the vines traveled so fast to Europe that the aphids survived. The only sure thing is that the first time phylloxera was noticed was in Hammersmith, a suburb of London in 1863, but some historians blame a wine merchant from the Rhone region who took some of our plantings to his vineyard in 1862. The first vines in France's Rhone region started to deteriorate. It wasn't until July 15, 1868, the French officially declared that the problem was phylloxera. By then, it was too late to help. In a span of 20 years, estimates of 2/3 to 9/10 of Europeans' vineyards were destroyed. They also had problems with fungus, mildew, and black rot. California also had a phylloxera problem. The insect arrived here in the mid-1800s and destroyed many of the European plantings that were here for years. Fewer than half of the grapes planted in 1800 remained till 1900. In the 1850s, American and California wines industry was taking off. In 1852, the first successful planting of French grapes were done by Charles Lefranc and what would become Almaden Vineyards. In 1857, Buena Vista Winery opened in Sonoma, and that is considered California's oldest commercial winery. In 1858, the first winery opened in Napa Valley, and in 1861, Charles Krug opened his winery in St. Helena. In New York, America's first bounded winery opened in 1860. At the same time, America was experiencing its worst nightmare of its own. The Civil War was starting. Although the Civil War in America had no terrible effect on its wine industry, some trade was interrupted. Most vineyards were not in the areas where the battles took place. Places like New York, Ohio, Texas, and Missouri, along with California, of course, was where most of America's wine was being made. Missouri wine was being made mostly by the Germans who settled there in the 1830s. Missouri was second behind California in wine production until Prohibition. Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia's vineyards were probably affected the most. With a large portion of men fighting the war, vineyards were neglected. Some of the vineyards couldn't have been in the path of Sherman's march through the Carolinas and then his campaign to Atlanta. The good news for wine was that science was starting to advance. In 1857, Louis Pasteur was making new discoveries. One of them involved yeast and how it turned sugar into alcohol. This led to the development of better fermentation techniques and his greatest discovery, germ theory. Pasteur's research showed that microorganisms were responsible for the spoiling of beverages such as beer, milk, and wine. He invented pasteurization, the process of heating liquids such as milk. The contamination by the microorganism also led him discovering that they also affect animals and humans alike. Benjamin Waterhouse had created a smallpox vaccine in 1798. so Pasteur's discovery wasn't the first of its kind, but did lead other scientists to develop surgical alcohol-based antiseptic and then to a mouth antiseptic called Listerine. At around the same time, Charles Darwin published his book, On the Origins of Species. This book eventually led to genetics and helped viticulturists to find the different grapes throughout the world. More good news was happening for wine. In Texas, of all places, somewhere in the 1880s, a viticulturist born in Illinois, named Thomas Munson, had been studying rootstock development. After moving to Texas, where his brothers were, he sent some American grape Phylloxera-resistant rootstocks to Europe and ended up saving the wine industry there. It took many years to replace the damaged vineyards throughout Europe. France especially had a shortage of grapes, and while they were fixing the problem, fraudulent wine started showing up. Because of that, France enacted Appellation Contrôlée, which is the motto for all wine-producing countries to protect wine trade reputations and consumer buying. Winemaking grew in America throughout the rest of the 1800s. Again, California was leading the way, but other regions in America were making wines that were on the wine lists of the best restaurants. Barrels of California wines were being exported all over the world. The influx of so many people into California during the gold rush made it possible for a craft like winemaking to thrive. Many wineries that are still open today were started, none more so than in Napa Valley. In 1875, Beringer opened. 1879, Inglenook Winery opened. Napa Valley alone added 15,000 acres to make a total of more than 18,000 acres of vineyards. At the 1889 World's Fair in Paris, Inglenook won gold medals. Not only did they win, a Virginia wine won gold, but the grand prize was awarded to Charles Wetmore of Cresta Blanca Winery in Livermore, California. The French had entered around 14,000 wines, and the colonies are around another 5,000 wines, despite having most of their vineyards destroyed from the Phylloxera insect. During the 1800s, problems for the American wine industry were taking effect. In 1816, Indiana prohibited alcohol sales on Sunday, which is still a law today. In 1846, Maine became the first state to outlaw the sale of alcohol except for industrial and medical use. They followed that up in 1851 with the stronger law, and by 1855, most of the New England states had gone dry and several other states had ideas to do the same, but in 1856, Maine's law was repealed with just a few restrictions. By 1861, only Maine, Vermont, and Connecticut still had prohibitions on alcohol. In 1880, though, Kansas became the first state again to go on dry. This was followed by Iowa, Georgia, Oklahoma, Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Virginia. Some of these states allow winemaking to continue for sale as long as it wasn't in their own state. In December 1917, Congress passed the 18th Amendment criminalizing the manufacturing, sale, and transportation of intoxicating beverages. By February 1919, 45 states had ratified it. On January 16, 1920, national prohibition began. New Jersey held out until 1922, and only Connecticut and Rhode Island rejected it. The way around the act was that it was not a federal crime to possess alcohol, and Section 29 of the act allowed 200 gallons of non-intoxicating cider and fruit juice. Intoxicating was defined as anything more than 0.5% alcohol, but the Bureau of Internal Revenue struck that down, which effectively legalized home winemaking. This caused a lot of problems throughout America. The newest immigrants from all over the world couldn't understand how this was a law. Businesses that depend on alcohol and the manufacturing of it went out of business. Wineries and vineyards closed. We know what happened in places like Chicago and New York. Also from the hills that made moonshine. By 1925, 94% of wine production had dropped from Prohibition times. Not all wine-producing states were devastated by Prohibition due to the clause which allow home winemaking. California's vineyards survived. Not only did they survive, but California's vineyard acreage doubled from 1919 to 1926. California had around 300,000 acres of vineyards in 1919 and around 600,000 acres in 1926. And grape shipments had grown 125%. The problem was that in order to be able to ship grapes around the US, the new vineyards were planted in grapes that survived the journey, but were a lower quality wine grape. Some vineyards also sold the juice as a concentrate, and at times this came with a warning. After dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug right away and cover for 20 days because it will turn into wine. The next problem was that the grape market became oversupplied and the boom went bust. Then in 1929, the stock market crashed, which led to the Great Depression. Things went from bad to worse. Most wineries that did not make Sacramento wines during the Depression were closed. It took decades for America's wine industry to come back strong. Some wine regions didn't rebound until the late 20th century, and the quality wines even later. California, even as late as 1961, only had 800 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon. The same went for Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Riesling, which we had just a few hundred acres apiece. Wine production of wine in the US in 1919 was 55 million gallons. In 1925, it was down to a little bit more than 3.5 million. Franklin Roosevelt ran for president in 1932, partly on the platform of repealing the 18th Amendment. He kept his promise. On December 5th, 1933, the 25th Amendment was ratified, ending prohibition. Not all states became quote-unquote wet. Kansas stayed dry until 1948, Oklahoma until 1957, and Mississippi not until 1966. 17 states chose to become control states. This means that state controls the sale of liquor in a state-run alcohol beverage control, or ABC liquor stores. A few other states allow some counties to have ABC stores. This problem still remains today, and shipping wines around the United States is like shipping wine to 50 different countries. America's wine industry was crippled badly during and after Prohibition and the Great Depression. Vineyards and wineries alike were in a state of disrepair. With World War II included, America lost a generation of winemakers. By the 1940s, America's thirst for wine greatly diminished. America was consuming only 1 gallon of wine per person per year, while France was consuming 40 gallons per person. California was to become a leader of winemaking at that time. The University of Davis in 1935 established a viticulture and enology division, which quickly became a world leader in the areas of grape growing and winemaking. This was originally at Berkeley from 1880s till 1919, but it closed due to Prohibition. The quality of grapes and winemaking were about to change. The troops returning from Europe had been exposed to the higher quality wines and brought home with them an appetite for better wine. Before Prohibition, 3 out of every 4 gallons of wine shipped was table wine. In 1933, it had changed to fortified wines. California's reputation was ruined by the change. Gallo was selling jug wine, and that is what the world knew about American wine. It would take the 1976 Paris tasting for California's reputation to return. That is why it was such a shock. Not only was America and California back in the wine business, but now it was held in the same esteem as French wines. The California wine industry, with people like Gallo's and Robert Mondavi, were now able to compete with European wines. They also now had the clout to invest in European wineries, Gallo in Italy, Mondavi in France. Mondavi also invested in Chile. The biggest growth was that now foreigner investors wanted to be involved with the American wine trade. Things moved fast after that. Today, America is the 4th largest producer of wine in the world, behind Italy, France, and Spain. California itself is 5th. America's taste for wine also is at an all-time high. In 2013, the US became the leader in wine consumption by volume. California and the Napa Valley are now on par with places in France like Burgundy, Bordeaux, and Champagne for producing great wine. Thank you everyone for listening. This has been great. Thank you.